And the stories I'm going to cover this week, uh, the first is a story of what some wealthy people do. The founder of the Patagonia uh, chain of stores is giving away his company to help fight the climate change crisis. And so that's somebody who is putting his resources uh, to what he hopes are good public use. The tech story I actually have two tech stories. The first one is about the RoboBug, which is a rechargeable remote control cyborg cockroach. Now, I'm not sure we need cyborg cockroaches, but somebody spent a lot of effort on this. The next tech story is one that is for our Mexican audience, and that is the US and Mexico are agreeing to cooperate on semiconductors and electric vehicles. And so I think the US is still trying to turn up its trade relationships in this hemisphere instead of in Asia and China. The environmental story is uh, something that argues differently about the cost for the switching to renewable energy. And here they're saying instead of that switch having a cost, that it will save trillions of dollars, which is kind of the opposite of a cost. The story in space is the search for intelligent life is about to get a lot more interesting. And the though we've read a lot about it, it turns out we're getting ready to enter a new phase. Part of that new phase comes from new tools like the web. Another part of the new phase comes from new approaches. And the biology story is an animal story about the war between humans and cockadoos in Australia over garbage. And it sounds to me like the cockatoos may be winning. Then I have an anthropology story, uh, which is about a mythical Welsh kingdom that there are stories about this kingdom drowning by the sea, and evidence now supports that idea that there was this place that drowned by the sea. When I'm into the story, I'll tell you a little bit more about what the legends say about why it drowned in the sea. And I think uh, at least it's an amusing story. And then finally, there is a human story about aging. And it's not about the problems of aging like most of the things we read. Rather, it's about the advantage of aging. And I think that's something that we all are interested in. And I suspect we all actually participate in. So that's what we got for the week. And starting from the top, the story about Patagonia. Yves Chouinard, who's the billionaire founder of the outdoor apparel brand Patagonia, says that he is giving away the company to a trust that'll use its profits to fight the climate crisis. And so instead of his private company, and instead of taking it public, like one of the things we hear about, or selling the company so he can cash out of his profit, uh, he is transferring this company worth $1.2 billion to a trust in a nonprofit organization. And instead of extracting value from nature and transforming it into wealth for investors, he says, we'll use the wealth Patagonia creates to protect the source of all wealth, meaning the planet. And the trust will be overseen by members of his family, so he's going to still keep his hands uh, in the action. But the way that he structured this transaction means that he and his family get no financial benefit from the donation. In fact, they're going to face a tax bill because of that donation. So this is one, I think, kind of rare example now of one of these rich guys figuring out how to use his money to benefit all of us. There are others that have done it, like Bill Gates, but it still seems to be the exception. How about you guys? Would you give all your wealth away?
Probably not, but I do. I'm kind of a contrarian on this. The family still runs it, and I bet they get paid nicely some for running it. So they're still employed very nicely. I'll bet.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to take away anything from that. This is a great idea, uh, a good deal. I'm glad to see him do it. I wonder if the money will all be spent on Patagonia, the country.
Probably very little of it will get to Patagonia.
Yeah.
But you wonder too, what's the story behind the story?
Yeah, the details.
Because a lot of this virtue signaling that rich people do is because they have so much money that the money isn't as important as their reputations. So they're keen to fluff up their reputations, and maybe that's a good thing. But
But
it's
anyway, in this case, since he's known to begin with as essentially as an outdoorsman and kind of an adventurer, to me, it's he's somebody who has shown a lot of interest in the outdoors and the environment his whole life. So to me,
does Patagonia have a good reputation as far as sourcing their fabrics and their
I don't know.
construction, or does it come from Bangladesh or someplace?
I don't know.
The other thing is, I wonder how these wealthy philanthropists decide where they're going to splash their money around, because I would think he would have been better off to put it into improved education of the masses than just turning it over to the people who want to tilt at the climate change windmill. You know, because everybody who's aware recognizes that we're not going to shift away from fossil fuels very quickly, and there's going to continue to be CO2 releases into the atmosphere for the next 50 years, at least. So I don't know.
Well, in terms of what people do, if you look at what Gates did, Gates set up a foundation and had different kind of competitions to have
He,
people apply for grants and have some way of evaluating them in terms of their benefits.
yeah. Is there a annual report from the Gates Foundation on the projects they've
I'm sure,
sponsored
I'm
and the
sure, I'm
results?
sure there is.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but maybe it's just not getting the media attention that it deserves.
Mhm. Anyway, what I would like to see from the rich guys is a competition to see who could give away the most money. Just like I would like to see from the nuclear weapons uh, countries an annual competition to see who could get rid of the most of their nuclear weapons that year.
Yeah,
So let's use this competitive spirit in a different way.
yeah. What would be the win for the donors? I
Yes.
guess recognition.
Well, sure. What they have enough stuff. They have enough money where if they can't spend it all, no matter how many yachts they need.
Yeah,
Maybe they could try spending all their money on a new bridge from, say, the USA to Europe. Engineering projects are cool, right?
yeah. Didn't Trump want to buy Greenland from Denmark?
He wanted to trade uh, Puerto Rico for it.
Oh,
That had just shown up in the news recently. I don't know how credible it is, but it's bizarre enough where I'm willing to believe it. Anyway, continuing along the the path that we are on, then let me show you the RoboBug. This is cool, I think. Here we are. Here, let's look at it. So here we have the cockroach, and on his back is both a battery pack and the electronics, and the electronics includes a radio receiver, because what good is having a robot bug if you can't uh, give it commands? And then on this back section here is a flexible solar cell. So, if you have a battery, you have to charge your battery upright. And we also have the wiring. I'm not sure if that's a very neat wiring job, and I think they could do a better job with the wiring harness. But uh, it is a different use of technology. And so here, researchers in Japan have created uh, a remote control cyborg cockroach, just what we need. And it's equipped with a uh, wireless control module and powered by a rechargeable battery that is charged by the solar cells. There are a lot of engineering problems involved in uh, building your robo cockroach, and they were able to solve them all. They have ultra thin electronics and they're using flexible materials because the animal needs to be able to move freely. And researchers have been trying to design cyborg insects uh, to do things like to help inspect hazardous areas or monitor the environment. But to be practical, and I'm still not entirely sure how practical a cyborg cockroach is, but to be practical, the handlers need to be able to control them, and they need to have a long duty cycle. So they need to be able to control them remotely for long periods of time. Uh, and so the wireless controllers uh, let them control their leg segments. And basically, it sounds like the commands that they can give them are basically turn right or turn left or go straight. And keeping the battery charged is essential. And they thought because of this, the best solution was to include an onboard solar cell that can work to keep it charged. It's a problem making the solar cell. They tried different thicknesses. They need to make it real thin, and were able to figure out an ultra thin organic solar cell to do it. And they needed to figure out an adhesion system, a system to stick this stuff, the solar cell, to the back of the cockroach. And so they used Madagascar cockroaches, which are about 6 centimeters long, and they attached the wireless leg control module and the lithium polymer battery to the top of the insect using a specially designed backpack. Maybe they could go to Patagonia to design their cockroach backpack. I don't know. But here, the backpack was 3D printed from an elastic polymer and designed to fit the curved surface of the cockroach. And the organic solar cell is 0.004 millimeters thick. That's pretty thin. And mounted on the dorsal side of the abdomen, and it achieves a power output of 17 milliwatts, which isn't much, but it's enough to charge the battery. And it's 50 times greater than the power output of any other energy harvesting system on other living insects. So it's a real step up on living insect power sources. And one problem is the abdomen changes shape and position as the cockroach moves around. So it was tricky sticking the solar cell on its back, and they made some interleaved structure coming off that had some parts that had sticky material on it and some that didn't, so they could flex as the insect flexed. And so the driver can make the cockroach turn right or left. And they think their strategy can be used to adapted to other insects like beetles, or maybe even flying things like cicadas. And so here now we have our cyborg cockroach. What they didn't talk about, though, if you're going to use this to do something like explore some area, another use for these things that I've heard of is in rescue situations where somebody is, trapped under the rubble of an earthquake. Then wouldn't you want a camera or some kind of feedback? If you're driving a cockroach, how do you know how to drive the cockroach and when to turn right and when to turn left? So I think the next revision, needs to have one of these tiny cameras on its head, and I guess you need a much more powerful transmitter to transmit video. But wouldn't you want to have video control under your cyborg cockroach? I know I would.
You just about have to have it. And I was looking it up. This is about the size of the cockroach.
Okay, okay. It's probably it's a pretty big one.
It's big. It's very big.
I think that may have been why they chose it.
Yeah. But yeah, I also thought about, what use is it if it doesn't have a camera? You got to have a camera.
Right, right.
And the camera miniaturization technology has gotten to where I think it's very possible.
Right. I think the camera actually is not a problem. As I was saying, the problem that I anticipate is getting a receiver with enough bandwidth, a transmitter with enough bandwidth to usefully send the camera. And if you're driving your cockroach around, wouldn't you want a real-time signal from the cockroach, just like the Ukrainians got from those drones over the Russians?
Right.
Well, the other thing too is they're going to have fuel the cockroach as well as fuel the electronics. So they have to be able to give the cockroach time off to find its dinner and things like that.
Okay, they have to have a dinner break for the cockroaches.
Well, so maybe the cockroaches will have shift work and they'll only work 8 hours a day or something.
Okay, that's right. Okay, now we're going to have unionized cockroaches. I can see it now. On strike, shut it down. Well, I'm glad that our fantasy muscles continue to work. It's hard not to bring up fantasies when the story is of the cyborg cockroach. Then the next story for us people with kind of Mexican persuasion is Mexico and the United States now plan to take advantage of the Biden administration's big investment in semiconductor production to push for the integration of their supply chains and cooperate in expanding the production of semiconductors and EVs through Mexico's nationalized lithium industry. I didn't realize that AMLO had nationalized it, but he nationalized it in May. And both efforts seek to eat into Asia's advantage in semiconductors and batteries. And they say there are major elements in the semiconductor supply chain that are already well established in Mexico. I haven't paid enough attention to it to actually understand that. And they say, though, companies like Intel is doing R&D and design in Mexico, as well as assembly and test operations in Mexico. What they are not doing yet in Mexico that is key if you're making semiconductors is to make semiconductors. They don't have any fab efforts that are going on in Mexico that I've heard of yet. And you got to have wafer fab if you're making semiconductors, right? Part of the issue that we have is so much of the manufacturing capacity now is in Taiwan. One of the reasons that we want to protect Taiwan is that protects the semiconductor production capacity in the world. They're spending a lot of money in the US bringing capacity back in the US, but that still takes 2 years to build a new semiconductor plant. Plus, what are they now? $5 billion or something? They're not cheap. Anyway.
Well, and in the US, isn't there legislation that requires all their military equipment to use locally sourced equipment?
Uh,
And
I bet there is. And, part of the problem with mil spec things is they have to be produced under real tight controls.
well, and
And,
there was something about that latest F-35 fighter jet being grounded because it had
right.
some component that was not
Yes.
US sourced.
There was Chinese source
Yeah,
specifically. Yep. Yep.
but when Taiwan fabricates 90% of the world's semiconductors, you'd wonder how much capacity was anywhere else. Like
Hmm.
for the US military, they must use a lot of semiconductors in their machinery and
Well,
their
again, I
missiles.
was in the semiconductor business for a long time, and the typically like National Semiconductor that I worked for had a very big operation to produce military semiconductors. There are two parts of the problem to oversimplify it. One problem with military semiconductors is you need to have at least some of them what they call radiation hardened, that is able to take higher degrees of radiation in the case of things like these EMPs and nuclear attacks and stuff like that, because you would like to have your electronic systems survive that. That was also a problem for satellites, is the radiation hardening. And then another part of the thing was to stress and burn in the semiconductors so you eliminate all of the beginning parts of the infant mortality, so that by the time they're installed in something, you have a high probability that they're going to work.
It's sort of the bathtub curve.
Right. Cut
Yeah.
off the front part of the bathtub curve and you have the flat part.
Yeah.
Is the idea. Actually, while I was at National Semiconductor, before I left, a good friend of mine offered me the job of being operations manager for the high rail operation. I would have 300 people working for me. He said, "You're such a good team manager, Richard. You should do that. You don't want to be in what you're planning to be in marketing, where you're recognized because of the merits of your own work." And the more he talked about being the team leader, the more he convinced me to take the new job. I'd just gotten through a stint where I had about 20 people and 5 different managers working for me. And uh, that job in some ways was the worst job I ever had, because my workload consisted of everything everybody else couldn't do. And then the time where the people who worked for me came in my office and closed the door and then talked to me about all of this stuff that I didn't want to hear about. Anyway, so I refused that job. Then the other thing that happened a few months after that is the guy who wanted to hire me was called up in front of a congressional committee that was investigating National Semiconductor, because it turns out National Semiconductor, to get their production up, was lying about the testing they were doing for the government. And if I'd have taken the job, I would have been sitting in the chair next to him.
Does National Semiconductor still exist, or are they
They
long
still
gone?
they still exist. They're a minor player,
But Intel and AMD are the big ones, aren't they?
right?
Yeah. But does Intel have all their manufacturing in Taiwan? Or,
Oh, Intel still does a lot of manufacturing in the U.S. They have a giant facility in Oregon.
okay.
And they are one of the ones that are building, I think, in Arizona or something like that, another new giant one. And so Intel still has a lot of capacity left
Yeah,
here.
there's one, they're building one in Chandler on the south side of Phoenix, and it's supposed to be the crane capital of the US right now because they have these monster cranes there loading these monster concrete beams for the
Okay. It would
buildings.
make me wonder about putting a semiconductor factory in the desert because they use a lot of water.
They use a lot of sand too, so maybe what they,
The form of the sand they use is not available locally.
oh,
Have you ever seen where they grow these ingots?
the
It,
crystals, the silicon crystals. No, I haven't.
yeah. Anyway, it's again, it's a fairly amazing process, and it's a chemical bath, and they have an ingot in there, and they are able to just grow the crystalline silicon around it. And one of the limits in the industry is how big they can grow those crystals, because that means that's how big they can make the wafers.
One of the interesting things about this Mexico business is Mexico's lithium reserves are well down the list of world reserves. The big ones are in Chile and Bolivia and Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
And there are high concentrations of lithium in Sonora, Mexico, but the whole operation in Sonora is owned by a Chinese company. So I don't know if this nationalization of the industry
Well,
would.
yeah, I wonder about that because the article says that Obrador nationalized lithium production in May. And so maybe that changed and maybe he stole it from the Chinese, fair
Well,
and square.
there could be all kinds of smoke and mirrors in that
Sure.
kind of arrangement.
Sure. Anyway, and so Obrador says that uh, because of this lithium operation, he's going to try to turn Sonora into a center for EV production. So he'll be trying to make batteries and EVs in Sonora.
You know, one thing that was just barely mentioned is that this can help with the immigration problem by having more people stay in Mexico, work
Right.
in Mexico instead of come north. This was part of uh, the Obama and before that Clinton
Mm-hmm.
and Hillary. It was all part of that plan was to strengthen the Latin American countries,
Mm-hmm.
strengthen
And
their economies.
mm-hmm. And certainly, semiconductor industry provides a lot of not just jobs, but high-paying jobs, because especially if they're talking about doing R&D and chip development, uh, those guys are well paid.
Absolutely. And as you guys know, there's a lot of real smart Mexicans in Guadalajara and
Yes,
Mexico City, and there's
yes, yes, indeed.
yeah,
And I have a friend who has a uh, instrumentation business bringing high-tech instruments into Mexico and then selling them to the company. And for him to be in this business, he has to have a technical staff with a real high degree of skill because they need to be able to go around the world and learn how to use and support all these high-tech gadgets.
And does he ever talk about security problems?
He has never talked about that to me. There has to be, you'd think.
Well, because in Mexico, there's this whole industry of kidnapping and minor ransom awards. And
Yeah, anyway, he's in the middle of Guadalajara, and so far I don't hear about that from him. He does say if I ever want to travel anywhere in Mexico, that I should ask him first, and he'll tell me if it's safe. Okay, so next up is renewable energy, and this is a new study from Oxford University. Some people would consider them to be a credible source. And they say that the transition to renewable energy could save the world $12 trillion by 2050. So they're not talking about what it will cost, they're talking about what it'll save. And researchers now say that going green makes economic sense because of the falling cost of renewables. And this is a quote from the study. Our central conclusion is that we should go full speed ahead with the green energy transition because it's going to save us money. And the report's findings are based on looking at the historical price data for renewable and fossil fuels and then modeling how they're likely to change in the future. uh, Renewables have had continual improvements in technology that has meant the cost of solar and wind power have fallen rapidly at a rate approaching 10% a year. And they expect that these the price of renewables will continue to fall based on modeling of data of how massive investments and economies of scale have made other similar technologies cheaper. And this is another quote. Our latest research shows that scaling up key green technologies will continue to drive their costs down. And the faster we go, the more we'll save. And right now, wind and solar are already the cheapest option for new power projects most places in the world. And this study really changes the thinking. As recently as 2019 in the UK, their Chancellor of the Exchequer wrote to the Prime Minister saying that the cost of reaching net zero in the UK by 2050, the cost was going to be more than $1 trillion. And this study talks about benefits rather than costs. And they say the likely costs of the 2019 study, the costs were overestimated. And because they are overestimated, it really has deterred investment. And so the transitions to renewables, this study says, is likely to turn out as a net economic benefit.
The thing about all these studies is you have to look at the actual inputs to the study, because a lot of the benefits are things like reduced health costs. So they imagine the health costs of continued fossil fuel usage are going to be extreme. And then they credit the renewables with the imaginary reduction in health costs.
But the imaginary reductions in the healthcare costs, as one example, during the Olympics that were in Beijing, uh, Beijing took enormous efforts to reduce the levels of air pollution that were present in Beijing during that period, and it turns out there was an enormous reduction in healthcare costs during that same period. So the reduction, while it might seem outlandish to some, there is actual evidence that supports it.
The other thing is, if this is such a great idea, you'd think the greedy capitalists would be all over it and be building alternative energy everywhere, but they're not. So I don't know. I guess we'll see. It won't take long. 5 years goes by in a blink, and
Right,
before you know
right,
it, we'll
right.
know.
And one of the things I believe we're going to see in that 5 year time frame, besides more EVs on the road, is we're going to see a difference in air pollution in the big cities. You know, it might be possible to go to some of them and actually breathe. You know, I saw also being from California and in a place where the pollution problem was kind of a leader in the world, and then California made regulations to change things. One of the things that I saw with the pollution control on auto vehicles in California is I saw the air actually get cleaner in the cities.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have happened without legislation. The
Right,
automakers wouldn't have done it.
absolutely. So sometimes the government can be a benefit for somebody besides the rich guys. We can't hear you, Chad. I can see your mouth flapping.
Why can't you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, the California just passed a law to outlaw the sale of inner combustion engine automobiles effective, I think it's 2035. So it's that's a big deal, and it's
Yes.
a sign of things to come for the U.S. I think.
And there are a bunch of states that now follow California's lead on automobile emissions. So we're going to see, I believe, other states make similar rules. That also fits with GM's plan. They say by 2035, they're not going to be making ICE cars either.
Right.
Well, does that prohibit existing cars or just new
No,
cars?
new cars.
Just new cars.
You know, one of the things that's going to start to happen is this happens is demand for gasoline is going to go down, and in the usual case, that would mean the prices would go up. The problem is going to be the oil companies, I bet, are going to have excess gasoline that they can't get rid of. So they're going to have pricing trouble figuring out what is the right price to make everything work. And when the number of cars on the road goes down, it's hard to increase the amount of oil you pump by selling more gas to the non-existent cars. Anyway, we'll see.
We'll see.
I was happy to hear about California's rules. You know, that still doesn't mean, I still think the oil companies are spending incredible amounts still on exploration and developing new wells. So they think there's still money to be made.
Well, they know the reality is there's a huge demand for energy that
Right,
just cannot be satisfied by alternatives
right, right.
anytime soon. Yeah.
At least for now. Okay, so let me go on to the search for intelligent life on other planets. I know some people think that before we find intelligent life on other planets, we should see if there's intelligent life on this one, but that's a whole nother discussion. Even though Arden is given rave reviews for that comment. Okay, in 1989, Galileo. Remember Galileo? Galileo was launched from the space shuttle, looped around the sun, and then on its way out, it flew around the Earth too. And Carl Sagan was a member of the science team on the Galileo, and he found this flyby really exciting because it let him think about what a spaceship might find looking at a far off planet for signs of intelligent life. And he saw there was plenty to see on the Earth. There were all these blazing lights and heat islands and atmospheric gases moving around and radiation leaks and all of this buzz of billions of gadgets and antennas and stuff. And so he was excited that you could see lots of signs of technical life anyway. And the question in this search for extraterrestrial life, of course, is would other planets' civilizations be like ours? And, you know, if you look at it now, there are telescopes that sweep the sky that are searching billions of frequencies simultaneously for electronic signals whose origins can't be explained by natural phenomena. But coming up, the search for intelligent life is turning in a new direction. This started in 2018 with a meeting in Houston where a bunch of technologists and researchers focused on what they call techno-signatures. And then they are working with NASA's help and want to seek out signs of technology on distant worlds. And they're looking in different ways. One of the ways, for example, is atmospheric pollution. Our atmosphere is a sign that pollution is possible with a technological society, and maybe we can find that in the astronaut. Anyway, this meeting was the beginning of a new era, and shortly after the meeting, a new group started, which is catalyzing atmospheric techno-signatures, or CATS. And this is funded with a grant from NASA. And the ambition for CATS is to create a library of possible technical signatures. And it's not about communicating with aliens, and it's not meant to contribute to research on extraterrestrial radio transmissions. They're instead thinking about the atmosphere of distant objects. And this line of inquiry wouldn't have been productive a few years ago, but we've made big advances in instruments and telescopes, like with the Webb, and we're also making big advances in the identification of planets. This identification of planets is going so well now that researchers are saying, quote, pretty much every star you see in the night sky has a planet around it, if not a family of planets. And given there are 100 billion stars in the Milky Way, and they think about 100 billion other galaxies, there are a lot of candidates, a lot of places to look for life. And the number is almost too big to imagine. And the we are now beginning with the Webb to be able to probe atmospheres and looking for smaller, weaker signals. And this is something we couldn't have done until fairly recently. And the Webb can analyze the atmosphere of nearby planets like Jupiter and Mars, and that's planned to happen in the next year. And these capabilities can also be directed at some of the closest Earth stars, like those surrounding a small planet, TRAPPIST-1, that's 40 light years away, that they've identified that has a bunch of planets. And the goal of this part of it is to be able to detect a biosignature, and it might be in the form of particular mixes of gases, for example, hydrogen and oxygen and methane and water and CO2. And these might suggest an atmosphere, some kind of a microbes or plants. And so any search for biosignatures on a different planet would also probably overlap the search for technosignatures. And so there are many new ways. The atmospheric searches include the ideas that they have come up with in this CATS program. Is one is look for chlorofluorocarbons, which are an industrial byproduct. Look for the atmospheric impact of farming. Look for the emissions of nitrogen dioxide, which is an industrial product. And the search is going to be going on for a while. There's another instrument that is now planned called the LUVOR, the Large Ultraviolet Optical Infrared Surveyor, that is now defined and a project started. It's not going to be deployed though for another 20 years, so there's more instrumentation coming. And the people who think about this is they say that while looking for biosignatures is interesting, it's still fairly difficult. And technosignatures, they say, are more detectable than biosignatures, and technosignatures could last for billions of years. You know, we send these instruments out into space. We even have ones that are still going that are far away from the planet and going. It's a crummy 40 years, but these technosignatures might last longer than the civilizations that put them up. And one thing they say that is interesting is that if we are able to find more of these technosignatures, if we can start to detect through our instruments more technological civilizations, maybe this means that the future of technological civilizations might be better than some people thought. You know, finding others that somehow have survived what we're going through would be encouraging to the idea that maybe we could survive too. That would be nice, you know?
I can't help but bring up, that, forget a visit from outer space, from aliens, forget communications with them. It's just the numbers are too vast to make that happen. But if we could find proof that life exists outside of the Earth, intelligent life, I should add, that would be profound to religion and a lot of other things.
Yes. And
And what would we do with this information if, let's assume that one day we're going to discover that there is intelligent life, or at least industrialized life, or something outside of the Earth. What do we do with it?
Now, they cover that a little bit in the article, and they say the first thing to do is nothing. Just try to learn from it and figure out what's going on. Before we want to send them a telegram, we might want to learn what they're up to.
And the telegram takes light years away.
I know.
I was just reading, maybe one of our scientists here could help me with this, but I was reading a book that tried to get around the speed of light problem with communications by using entanglement as a means of communications. Say something here, they get it there,
right,
with nothing in between. And is that possible?
I've read some of the same stuff that you have, and they, who knows? There are a bunch of things we don't know. I guess it looks like entanglement does not follow the rules of the speed of light. I don't know if that is testing or theory at this point, because the entanglements that I've heard about, I'm not sure they're far enough away to be able to make some meaningful measure.
Good point.
I'd like to have an entanglement on the moon, for example. Then we would know.
Right.
And certainly in sci-fi stories, that's one of the things you read about is not only faster than light travel, but faster than light communication. Because if you can't communicate, it's hard to have command and control of your missions.
It's something to think about.
I know. I think it's not the most pressing problem, but it is certainly something to think about. And it would be cool to find something that didn't follow the Einstein's law.
I couldn't read the article because the New York Times want you to subscribe before they'll
Oh, I
open the
know.
article.
I'm sorry, it's behind a paywall.
Yeah, but anyway, there's an interesting book out called Turing's Cathedral, and it's about the early development of computers and the translation of Turing's ideas into actual hardware. And it was John von Neumann who was behind most of it.
Well, we've certainly heard of von Neumann architecture.
Yeah, but the author, George Tyson, talks about these machines' ability to reproduce themselves. And computer systems are now able to reproduce themselves, but in cyberspace as software. They don't reproduce the hardware.
Physically,
they just reproduce the abilities or the performance.
Right.
And he thinks that if there is intelligent life out there in the universe, they could be bathing the whole universe with these electronic signals for the last 100,000 years.
Or 100 million years.
Yeah, and these signals would go everywhere, but they would only create machines in their own image once they found a place that had a cyberspace existing. And so now that we've created cyberspace, we've created a habitat for these wide-ranging signals, and we may already have been kind of colonized or at least contacted by these systems that may have been sent out hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Well, my son runs big virtual systems for some corporation. They used to do it for Nike, and so that's a big system. It operates all their stores and everything, and it all operates in cyberspace. And somehow he has become one of the world's experts in terms of how you actually implement and run these things. He never graduated from high school, but that was not a problem. Anyway, it's an interesting idea, and I'll have to talk to him, and maybe he can see he has one of the places that might be occupied, and maybe if he sees some resource use he can't explain, then it is from the alien invasion.
Or if they find some virus that has no human source.
That's right.
But it'd be interesting to see if he has an opinion on this stuff and what he,
I will talk to him about it. That should be an amusing conversation. And he also has a big enough imagination that he'll catch on quickly to the idea. Okay, so maybe his virtual systems are being invaded by extraterrestrials.
well, and they say that these intelligent life forms that may have evolved on other planets may have evolved in entirely different circumstances and,
Absolutely.
and be entirely different from the way our carbon-based life forms have evolved.
Right. That's one of the problems that the scientists working on this talk about. They use as an example explorers when they first went into California. What they found, they were amazed by the wonders of nature, how there were all these fruit trees around, and the forest didn't have all this garbage at the bottom of it. And they thought it was this wonderful natural phenomena. And it turns out it was the agricultural practices of the people who lived there that were beyond their ideas of what you could do. So, anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah, we always look at anything new on the basis of our prior
Right.
experience.
What else can we do? Anyway, it's an interesting area, and this one is going to take us a while to find out about, I think. If the next big instrument to do probes there is 20 years away, we're in for a wait. And I guess Webb can explore the atmosphere, but only in planets and nearby stars. But then maybe we'll understand something. When we look at the atmosphere of 100 nearby planets, we'll know more than we know now. Okay, the next story I have is a story about the interactions between humans and the animals around us. It's not about the cyborg cockroaches, but rather it is in Australia, and it's the war between uh, these cockatoos. These are sulfur crested cockatoos. You can see it there, and garbage bins. It looks like in this case, the cockatoos won the war against that garbage bin. And cockatoos uh, now in Australia live in the suburbs, and they have been attacking these trash bins that are used for garbage there. And they're able to pry up the front, lift the lid from the side, and then walking around the side to flip the lid over, and then they can get in the trash. What they're particularly looking for are carbohydrates because they like bread. And while they're searching through the garbage for the carbohydrates, they're not neat about it and they throw the trash around. And uh, it the cockatoos learn this behavior from other cockatoos, so it's a kind of cultural transmission of the knowledge. And this cultural transmission in this case is not limited to the cockatoos because also humans are trying to figure out what we can do to prevent the cockatoos from getting into our garbage. And then it's cultural transmission among the humans too. And uh, the trash bins are emptied by a semi-automated arm on the top of the garbage truck that reaches out and picks it up and dumps the trash into the receptacle. And one of the things that the humans have tried to figure out how to do or to do to limit the cockatoos is by putting a brick or a rock on top of the garbage bin. And so the garbage men with their robot arm then look to see if there's a brick on it or a rock on it, and they shake it before they dump it in. And it turns out the cockatoos now have learned to use brawn instead of brain and push the bricks off. So uh, here we have the upgraded strategy of how to prevent the cockatoos from getting into the garbage, and then the cockatoos figure out a way to beat that problem. And so we're going to see this learning cycle going between the cockatoos and the Aussies. And they say in general, one of the things that's interesting about this is the humid bird innovation race is an exciting idea. And if you look at it, this idea extends to other animals. While we lived in California, we saw an example of that. We had a backyard in a lovely area next to a creek that was frequented by birds. And so we put a seed feeder in there to feed the birds. And the other thing that exists in all these trees by the river are squirrels. And so then the squirrels started to eat from the bird feeder. And over a period of a couple of years, we tried many different strategies to outsmart the squirrels. And everything we tried, we might do something that worked for a few days, and then the squirrels beat our system and we had to try something else. My wife and I thought that we were being instrumental in breeding a new race of smart squirrels. And I think this is like the struggles the Aussies have with the cockatoos. And it's just an interesting sidelight to the interaction between humans and the critters around us who use us as food sources. Have you guys had any experience with stuff like this?
Well, there was a similar thing in the UK with little birds learning to take the tops off milk bottles and
Oh, wow.
drink the cream out of the milk bottles.
Okay, so the milk bottles dropped on your porch by the milkman, they
Yeah,
would open up. Okay, that's clever.
they were the ones that had the paper
Right.
disc that was pushed into
Yes.
the.
Yes, I remember those from the
Yeah.
prehistoric days.
And we all know about seagulls and seagulls hanging around A&W outlets. And
Uh-huh. And raccoons
yeah, so
and bears.
yeah, in Canada, a lot of the trash cans have to be provided with a lid that defeats the bears.
It's
And
bear
what
proof. Okay.
you put your hand into the slot and push the release, and then only then will the lid raise.
Yes. Now, I remember when I was a kid, we were camping in Yosemite, and Yosemite has a problem with bears. And the bears, of course, if you had a freezer outside or anything, they would be able to figure out how to open it. And a guy in the camp next to us had uh, a bear-proofed freezer that he left out, and it had some lock on it. And the bear picked up the freezer, took it up to the top of a nearby mountain, and threw it off. And so these critters are pretty clever, especially when it comes to something important like where are they going to get the next meal. Okay.
Before we leave that subject, there was a story about Kamala Harris, and somebody asked her if she'd ever kissed a parrot, and she said no, but maybe a cockatoo.
Now that one sounds like it could be on the edge of a risque story. Okay, here we go. Anyway, thank you for your story, Andrew. And this one is about a uh, mythical Welsh kingdom, and uh, there are stories there of a kingdom that dates back to the medieval period. And while it's just a story, new evidence show that it could be a true story, and there's evidence about the changes in the Welsh coastline. Uh, there's the earliest map of Great Britain is about 1500 years old, and it shows there are two islands in the Cardigan Bay in West Wales, which no longer exist today. That's really in the area of this story. In the story, there are several versions of the story, and the oldest can be found in a Welsh fable history book called the Black Book of Carmarthen. And in this story, there was a country named Gwydno in the kingdom of Merodad, ruled by a man in 520 called Guido Garthnar. And this land was so fertile that 1 acre was said to produce as much as 4 acres on the mainland. And it was kept dry by a dike that kept the sea from flooding it. It was at low water level. And there were sluice gates at low tide that were open to drain water out of the land and closed then at high tide. And though there are several versions of the legend, they all center around some watch gate of the sluice gate, watchman of the sluice gate, who becomes distracted one night during the storm and leaves the sluice gates open. There are different stories about why he was distracted. The one that I like the most is he just got drunk and had too much fun at a party. And so he was too drunk to open the sluice gates. in another version of the story, it was the watchman and a fair maid who got so busy they forgot to close the sluice gates. And in all versions of the story, the land is drowned by the sea, and the residents are forced to leave their fair country. And the people who study this look along the coastline and they say 1,000 years ago, the coastline may have been about 13 kilometers further out than it is today. And this is shown by this ancient map, which is pretty accurate. And in this map, it shows islands nearby there that no longer exist. And these islands, they think, could have been low-lying or remnants of this low-lying land force, and erosion wore the land away, reducing it to islands before the islands were worn away. And there are other things around England that show this kind of thing has happened before. There is uh, excuse me, let me get the focus. Here is, if you see this map, on the left side, we show England, and on the right side, we show uh, Europe. And in between, we show this big area that they call Doggerland now. And it looks like that this land connection between Europe and England was flooded by the rising sea after the ice caps receded 10,000 years ago. And so between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, this land was flooded. The archaeologists have found evidence of human habitation under the sea in this area. And this area was pretty big. It looked like it was something like 20,000 square miles big, which is a pretty big area. And it was lost about 8,000 years ago, as I said, due to rising water. It was the effect at that time of the climate change that was due to the receding of the glaciers. And I think the sea rise at that time was about 100 feet. And so in Britain, there have been other places that are flooded. And I wonder if some of these legends, like Atlantis and things like that, might have been from this experience happening kind of before the memory of anybody in England, but it still is there.
Well, and
So
also
go.
the west coast of England is actually rising, and the east coast is sinking even now. And
Okay.
that mention of the coastline has moved 14 or 13 kilometers west
Uh-huh.
is also due to this rising of the
Okay.
west coast.
Okay.
But the interesting thing is, all of this stuff that's rising up would be overtaken by humanity. The interesting stuff is the stuff that's underwater that's been lost to humanity and is still to be discovered.
Mhm.
Like in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Alexandria and
Mhm.
off the coast of Egypt, there are relics of prior civilizations that have been
Also
submerged.
off northwest India, there is a uh, city under the sea that looks to be about 10,000 years old. And one of the questions about this is agriculture looks to be about 10,000 years old. And how do you have a city without agriculture?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's lots to be discovered that's underwater right now, and maybe that's where we should be spending our money. I don't know.
I'm sure there are people who would agree with you.
Yeah, the Patagonian guy could have turned his money loose on underwater exploration.
If he wanted to. And the final story for today is a story about you and me. And I say it that way because now 8 in 10 Americans agree society puts too much value on appearing youthful. I think we don't have to worry about that anymore. But a new poll also starts to identify the benefits of getting older. Let's hear it for the benefits of getting older. And this was a study of 2,000 adults, and they were examining perspectives around aging. And what they found is that most agree that there's a negative bias around aging or the perception of being old, so much so that 6 in 10 avoid sharing their age for fear of being judged as too old. But 3/4 of the respondents agree that age is not something to fight or fear, but instead is an opportunity to live a more fulfilling and emotionally healthy life. And many of them have actually seen areas of their life improve with age. That's 71%, more than 2/3. And these include things like confidence and their sense of self and their relationship with family members. And in fact, most people who have outgrown their 20s say that they feel more fulfilled and satisfied with their life today. And that's by about 2/3. So it's a big percentage. And anti-aging has been the norm in our society for some time. We're starting to see a shift, at least among Americans, who realizing that aging is living. And so 2/3 of the respondents say they actually feel younger than they are. Typically, they feel about a decade younger than they are. And the survey says that the top 4 benefits of aging are: first, they learn new things about themselves or the world every year. Next is they have more life experiences. That's one advantage of having more years. They report gaining wisdom and they report being more confident. And they say, what's the secret to living well as you age? 80% say a better attitude leads to graceful aging. And 7 in 10 say they are embracing their age, believing that getting older is not as bad as they thought it would be. I think that's kind of praising with faint damnation or something. So, what's your experience?
Well, you know, this reminded me of a book I read, I don't know, about a year ago called Travels with Epicurus. Epicurus was a philosopher about 300 BC outside of Athens, but he believed in, he's known for his hedonistic lifestyle, but but actually he had a philosophy, and that had to do with aging and how aging allows you to live. When you get to be an older age, you have less responsibilities and you're able to enjoy life more. You're able to enjoy the journey instead of the destination. Uh, savor the moment. He said that the most important thing in life is pleasure, is to be happy. By that, he meant be happy. And to be happy, you had to have good friends, good conversation. And he actually put his money where his lifestyle was and opened a commune just outside of Athens and invited philosophers, and everybody was welcome. They had to prove themselves once they got there, but everybody was welcome. And so it's not an old idea, but it's an idea I think whose time has come to rethink.
Right. Well, especially with the changing demographics of society, not only in America, but all over the world.
Absolutely.
There's more old people. And, if you look at us, we are the healthiest, longest lived generation that has ever been on this planet.
I believe it. Go ahead, Andy.
It would be interesting to know if there were differences of appreciation among different religions. Like I think the Buddhists may have different thoughts about aging than, say, Christians or Islamic people or whatever.
Right. Also, to look at it in different cultures, the ideas are very different. Some places like Mexico think that old people are good.
Yeah, and I think the people that enjoy aging, they're already physically healthy and financially healthy.
Or at least able to survive financially.
Yeah, and measures of financial health are different in different cultures.
Right.
Physical health, maybe less so, I don't know.
Epicurus was an atheist, but he had some Buddhist kind of tendencies. He said that he talked about the emptiness of striving for material goods, and
that sounds pretty Buddhist.
Yeah, that's pretty Buddhist. And so, yeah, it's an interesting book. I recommend it. It's by Daniel Keene, K-L-E-I-N. It's a short book. Can read it in just 3 or 4 hours.
And certainly, what I say, my job at this time in my life is to be happy.
Absolutely. Be happy, don't worry.
And, kind of what I've learned is that happiness is not from things, like Epicurus was saying. Happiness, to say it in a corny way, is an inside job.
He would say happiness is having good friends and good conversation.
Well, that's what we're doing here.
That's what we're doing here.
Okay, does everyone have enough happiness for the week? Okay, Arden says yes, so that means it's okay. Well, very good.
I'm okay.
Good to see you, and thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, thank you again.
And be happy. That's our job.